Today for today's local government education webinar offered through the University of Illinois Extension. And today's topic or conversation will be around energy transition policy considerations for Illinois. My name is Emily Rhodes, and I'm the Technical Assistance and Planning Manager for the Just Transition Fund. Our mission is to support communities economically impacted by the energy transition through planning and resource support. I'm joined today by my colleague, Cindy Winland, and our partners, Kathy Brown at the University of Illinois Extension, who's helping to host today's program, and Amanda Pankow with Prairie Rivers Network, which is a statewide nonprofit working towards the clean energy economy. You can read a bit more about our organizations on the bottom of the slide here. And I've also listed our contact information if you have questions or want to reach out after the webinar. This group, we've been working together for about a year now to bring together Illinois communities to discuss the impact that our nation and our state's energy transition is having on local communities. And after a series of conversations with county administrators and school superintendents and community college leaders focusing on this issue, we thought it would be a good idea to organize a webinar to discuss the different energy transition policies that are currently under consideration at the Illinois legislature. So for our agenda, before we dive into our panel discussion, I'm just going to cover a bit of housekeeping and discuss the goal for our time together today. Then I'll introduce and I'll pass it over to my partners, Amanda and Kathy, to moderate our panel discussion, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the session. So just a bit of housekeeping. All participants are on mute. And so if you have a question or a comment throughout the course of the conversation, please feel free to drop it into the chat box. We'll be monitoring that and then be addressing using those questions to talk to our panel of experts for about the last 15 minutes of today's conversation. We're also recording the webinar. So if you know someone who wasn't able to make it this afternoon, we'll be sharing out the link afterwards. It will be available on University of Illinois Extension's website. And so you'll be able to access it or share it out after today. And so the goal of our time together today is to discuss those energy transition policies that are currently on the table in Illinois, why they matter, and how these policies are helping to address some of the common issues that Illinois communities are facing. And some of those issue areas or common interests that some of the policies are seeking to address are things such as funding for renewable energy and energy efficiency programs, or addressing climate change, addressing consumer protections, or finally, the things that we've been discussing a lot with communities in central and southern Illinois is the impact that it will have on communities currently hosting fossil fuel generating stations, and how some of the policies can support through transitioning to a new economy. And so I'm going to pass it over to Kathy and Amanda to moderate our great panel of speakers today around these topics. Kathy?
Thanks, Emily. So to get us started in our conversation this afternoon, we've asked Doug Scott and Jessica Collinsworth to talk with us a little bit about, just why is it important that we consider energy policy at this time in Illinois? So Doug, would you like to get us started in that conversation?
Sure. Thanks, Kathy, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. I think there are a number of reasons why it's important to be looking at energy policy right now. First of all, climate pollution issues are ones that are very important to the governor and to most residents of the state, I think. The idea of decarbonizing the economy, trying to move that forward in a way that helps us alleviate some of the major issues we found, either with rising temperatures, with flooding, with some of the other natural disasters that are tied to climate. So that's certainly one reason for that. The other is that there are a number of changes that are happening anyway. There are major technology changes. There are major changes in the way customers are viewing energy policy. And so matching the policy to in Illinois to where some of the changes are happening, and trying to make sure that we can help influence them in a way that makes the most sense for the most people in Illinois is another reason. I think that we also really need to make sure that our energy policy acknowledges and tries to change some of the historical system, which has really left some communities behind, some low-income communities, communities of color, who have really borne a disproportionate impact in terms of how the energy system has evolved over time. And we really have an opportunity to try to change some of that with changing energy policy now. Transitioning to a new energy economy, cleaner, more accessible to more people, much more in terms of renewable energy, energy efficiency, electric vehicles. We're really poised to be able to make a lot of those changes here in Illinois. It's a great time to do that. And also to work on the issues that Emily talked about and that Kathy talked about what about these communities that have been, the host of plants and have had the jobs that are associated with them. What happens as the energy economy changes and some of the sources become cleaner? What happens to those communities who have had at least the benefit of having some of those jobs in their communities? The last thing that I'll point out, I think, is really important now. Some of the accountability and transparency provisions that you're going to see in a lot of the bills that are working their way through right now. Obviously, we've had some issues with the federal prosecutors looking at some of the practices here in Illinois. It's really important for us to address those issues and clean that up to the greatest extent we can. So there's a whole lot of reasons for looking at changes to energy policy right now.
Thanks, Doug. Jessica, do you want to add to that? Do you have additional comments that you'd like to make?
Yeah, definitely. And good afternoon, everyone. And Doug laid out a lot of them. I agree. There's a ton. And in my notes, I had like 15, but I'll spare you all and just talk about 2. I did want to dig a little deeper into why I think it's important to address energy policy at this time in Illinois due to the climate crisis. So we know we need to act now to avoid the worst impacts of climate change by moving to clean energy. And then the second one I want to talk about briefly is because we needed to deploy more renewable energy, but we can't because Illinois' renewable energy industry has fallen over a funding cliff. So without legislation that unlocks new resources, billions of dollars in new renewable energy development will stop. And I did see there's some folks on this webinar today that work in the solar industry. So definitely looking forward to furthering that discussion in the question and answer portion and discussion portion at the end of this conversation. So in regard to the climate crisis, one of the impacts of climate change is extreme heat, which is getting worse and is on track to get a whole lot more extreme in our lifetimes. While some populations are more vulnerable to heat, including both the elderly and young children, also outdoor workers, people who don't have air conditioning or can't afford to keep theirs on, everyone is susceptible to serious heat-related illnesses above certain thresholds. So extreme heat will likely affect more Americans in more locations than any other consequence of climate change and within the next 30 years. So it wouldn't be a UCS presentation unless I mention a UCS report or two. So the Union of Concerned Scientists released a report called Killer Heat in the United States, Climate Choices in the Future of Dangerously Hot Days back in the summer of 2019. I should also note that we have like another iteration of this report coming out this summer that looks specifically at outdoor workers and the impacts on them of job losses and sickness due to extreme heat. But the report that came out in 2019 project the frequency and intensity of the heat we can expect over the rest of the century. And the findings point to a dramatic increase in lethal heat across the country and lots of troubling outcomes for public health as a result of it. So looking at Illinois specifically, there have historically been 34 days per year on average with a heat index above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and this would increase to 80 days per year on average by mid-century and 107 days by century's end. So the state has also had historically 7 days per year on average with a heat index above 100, but this would also increase and be 43 days per year on average by mid-century and 69 days by century's end. And instead of having an average of only 2 days per year with a heat index above 105, we would then be looking at extreme heat events 26 days per year in Illinois on average by mid-century and 51 days by century's end. So the data, I should note, also looks deeper into, you can zoom the data into county and city level data. So looking at Chicago and Carbondale, just as examples, historically, Chicago has experienced 1 day per year with a heat index above 105, but with no action to curb carbon emissions. The city is projected to experience 14 days by mid-century and 34 by late century. And this increase in extreme heat in the state is even more pronounced in Southern Illinois. So Carbondale has historically experienced 3 days per year with a heat index above 105, but with no action on climate change this will increase to 41 by mid-century and 69 days by late century. So I'll drop the link to the report in the chat, but just some of the key takeaways are that failing to take action to reduce carbon emissions would lead to a staggering expansion of dangerous heat, as I just laid out. And then also aggressively reducing emissions could contain that expansion. So we need to act. So the time to act on climate is now, and we have to pass energy policy that addresses this. There's also a variety of other climate change impacts in the Midwest region. Doug touched on this as well, that in 2019, we saw between 200 to 600% the historical normal amount of precipitation, and how this extreme precipitation and historic flooding in the region was the primary reason that farmers across the nation were prevented from planting over 20 million acres of insurable crops. So as an agriculture state, that's an important impact that we need to look at as well. And then just lastly, thinking to the second reason I laid out of considering energy policy is the need to address the solar cliff in the state. Illinois solar programs are collapsing from lack of funds. So back in December 2020, the Illinois Power Agency announced that the popular solar savings incentive, known as the Adjustable Block Program, ran out of funding in the northern part of the state, which immediately ended the rebate program offered to new solar customers, made possible through the Future Energy Jobs Act that passed in 2016. And this has left the state without a foundational solar incentive program and halted job growth opportunities and halted savings from customers that want to put solar on their roofs. So a variety of issues, those are the two I wanted to touch on.
Thank you, Jessica and Doug. And I think one of our panelists, Reverend Tony Pierce, had a comment maybe in response to something Jessica said. So Reverend Pierce, if you'd like to chime in before we move on to our next question.
Thank you, Amanda. First of all, Doug and Jessica made a host of excellent comments relative to climate change. And Doug did mention the disparate impact that this has on some of our communities. I just wanted to drill down on that a little bit further. BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities have been severely or adversely affected by these coal-fired plants in terms of the slow violence that they create on communities in terms of asthma, COPD, and premature deaths. And to kind of add clarity to that, the BIPOC population in the United States is 31%. However, when we look at the surrounding population around coal-fired plants, the BIPOC population around those plants is 68%. So it's a tremendous disparity there. And as an example, even though the E.D. Edwards plant is closing in, I believe, 2022 outside of Peoria, when you look at the Latinx community in Waukegan, regarding the plant there that I think was been there since the 60s or somewhere around that time frame, there's 67,000 people living within 3 miles of that plant. And those folks are dramatically suffering, as I said, the slow violence of the asthma, the COPD, and the premature deaths. So those are some of the BIPOC issues that we need to be aware of that maybe the mainstream population is not as aware of, since they suffer less because they live less in those areas.
Thank you, Reverend Pierce, and thanks again to Doug and Jessica. So our next question really builds on the first of why. And so we're going to ask this question to each of the panelists, and it is, what critical issues need to be addressed through energy policy considerations? So I'm particularly interested in this question. I've spent the last 3.5+ years in my role at Prairie Rivers Network talking with people across Illinois about this exact question. And I talk regularly with environmental and social justice leaders from Waukegan to Cairo, youth climate activists across downstate college campuses, small solar business owners in Springfield, one of which is on today's call, small solar business owners in Bloomington, Champaign, small and large farmers in Piatt County, where I live, and local elected leaders in Havana and Canton, where their coal plants have closed, and many more consumers and community members. So you can imagine the varied energy and climate interests that I've heard, and that I know many of our panelists have heard, and they're working on the policy solutions to address those critical issues. So once again, I want to hear from each of the panelists. So what are the critical issues that need to be addressed through energy policy considerations? And since we haven't heard from Dave Collado with Citizens Utility Board, let's go ahead and start with you, Dave.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, I think at a macro level, we need to basically, there's a couple big issues here. One is, how can we decarbonize the Illinois electrical system as affordably and as quickly as possible? So we're really trying to solve here for the most cost-effective options to meet our climate change goals. As part of that, we want to make sure, of course, that consumers are protected, but as these new jobs are created in the clean energy economy, that there's really an equitable distribution of those jobs, that all communities have the opportunity to benefit from the clean energy economy. And this is one of the reasons why in the Clean Energy Jobs Act, you see equity being such a foundational principle that kind of ties through all parts of the bill. As you start going in on more specific issues, I do think at the end of the day, we need to essentially align our energy spending, our existing energy spending, with those overall state goals. And so this brings in an issue around, for example, capacity market reform, where in the case of Northern Illinois right now, we're spending about $1.8 billion a year on capacity, and about 1.4 billion of that is going to fossil fuels. So there's a whole host of policy changes that are needed to really make sure that we achieve 100% clean energy, that we're doing so in a consumer-friendly way, and that we're really jump-starting the clean energy economy in an equitable fashion. But as you start moving down the line, we have to make sure that the interconnection standards are improved, that we have a regulatory framework that is more transparent, has more utility accountability, and holds utilities accountable through performance metrics that are aligning the whole system, aligning all the incentives around affordable decarbonization and other state policy goals. So I think that, I agree completely with what Doug and Jessica and Reverend Pierce mentioned in the opening comments about, why there's what we need to do here, why there's an urgent need. There's a great opportunity in our view if we do this right. It's one that does require a comprehensive approach. There's a lot of complicated issues to think through, but we're confident that we can get this done and really make Illinois a national leader on achieving decarbonization in an equitable and affordable manner.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and go to Jessica.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And yeah, so what critical issues need to be addressed? A lot of what Dave just said. I would just add a little to needing to address developing a just transition for coal plant communities. So as folks on this call know, previously coal and nuclear power dominated Illinois' power sector, but here in Illinois, as in many other states, the economic competitiveness of aging and inefficient coal plants is in decline, and we're transitioning away from it. Even this week, I think on Tuesday, the 6th, Vistra announced they'll be retiring the Joppa plant by September 1st, 2022, so 3 years earlier than previously disclosed. So as we transition away from fossil fuels, we need to develop a plan that helps impacted workers and communities adapt to the inevitable energy transition and really to forge resilient economic futures for those communities. I would note we have a report from 2018 called Shift to Solar, Illinois' Clean Energy Transition, that looks at the public health, economic, and social equity gains that could result from replacing coal power plants in Illinois with clean energy technologies, such as wind, solar, energy efficiency, and energy storage. And the report did find that the faster we close these aging, polluting coal plants and transition to clean energy and energy efficiency, the greater the public health benefits, the greater the economic benefits for local communities and across the state. And that we really need to ensure that clean energy transition benefits everyone in Illinois, especially those currently burdened by pollution in their communities and low-income communities. Communities of color in particular, as noted earlier, have historically faced environmental injustices, including disproportionate exposure to toxic air pollutants, such as coal plant emissions. So we need to address that. So the transition to renewable energy and energy storage and energy efficiency will also lower electricity bills, reduce carbon emission, and lead to more diversified clean energy mix in the state. So I think as part of that as well, we need to think through what that transition looks like and what would be helpful. So one bill that puts a lot of focus on supporting fossil fuel workers and communities is the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which guides an orderly transition by putting workers and communities first, by creating a displaced energy workers Bill of Rights, supporting fossil fuel power plant, coal mine, and nuclear plant workers who lose their job due to reduced operations or closure. It also, the Bill of Rights includes advance notice of closure and financial advice, continued healthcare and retirement packages, and also tuition scholarships at Illinois state and community colleges and trade programs. So really aiming to help impacted communities. CEJA also designates communities that lose a fossil fuel power plant or coal plant as clean energy empowerment zones. And within those empowerment zones, there's an option to get tax-based replacement for up to 5 years to cover lost tax revenues. It also gives local leaders and economic development staff opportunities to find new opportunities for the community and provide incentives for clean energy companies to locate in clean energy empowerment zones. So I think that's a big one. I think too, so working to develop a just transition for coal plant communities. And then as was noted earlier, I think and also an important one is creating an equitable workforce. So we did create a thriving clean energy workforce in Illinois with the passage of the Future Energy Jobs Act in 2016. But that workforce does not currently reflect the diversity of Illinois, and key barriers still remain to entry, and CEJA's programs and initiatives will empower workers and entrepreneurs that currently lack easy access to the energy sector, access to it. So I think those are the two ones I wanted to touch on: creation of equitable workforce and a just transition for coal plant communities.
Thank you, Jessica. Reverend Pierce.
Thank you. Both Dave and Jessica have given great comments here, and so I just want to speak on it maybe from a comprehensive standpoint, because Dave already referred to the issue of alignment. And so as we look at this decarbonization from a comprehensive standpoint, we need to be looking at the intersections of obviously decarbonization, just transition, which Jessica just spoke on, gearing up and preferencing equity and the new energy economy so that everyone in the state benefits from that, and particularly the minorities or BIPOC communities that are being left out. It's important to remember that when the digital revolution was announced a generation ago and took place, that digital revolution transformed our economy, but it leapfrogged BIPOC communities. And there are many Black and Brown communities today that suffer from that. That can happen here in terms of a new energy economy that can leapfrog BIPOC communities. Evidence already is showing from FEJA that it is in the process of doing just that. So we have to make sure that CEJA really prevents that from happening, so that equity provisions are there to incentivize this new energy transition in these BIPOC communities. We have to bolster energy efficiency. We've obviously got to get started and look at the intersection of electric vehicles and overhauling utility regulation. So it's really the intersection of all of those things, because all of that is happening at once. And we have to make sure that it all happens in ways that advance the goals that are good for people, so that we do this in a way that puts people and the planet first, instead of ways that simply put companies and the bottom line first. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Pierce. Doug?
Thanks, Amanda. And you know, the problem with going last in a group like this is that they've so wonderfully said a lot of the things. But I'll follow up on something that the Reverend Pierce just said. When the governor put out his energy principles in August, he had the same name that roughly that Reverend Pierce just said. It's putting consumers and the climate first. You know, so as we start looking at all of these different policies, and what you're hearing from us on this call, and I think what we've seen in a lot of the discussions that have happened, is there isn't a lot of disagreement on kind of the direction that we want to go. It's more about how to accomplish it, how to pay for it. You know, what are the things that we need to take into account. So a lot of what the governor is looking at in his principles are how to pay for things, who ends up bearing the brunt of that, putting in a lot of things that Dave would naturally talk about, a lot of the consumer protections, trying to make sure that whatever we're doing is being done in a way that not only advances the clean energy economy, but that does so in a way, and I won't say the least cost way, because that's not really the point of it as much as it is the way that best aligns and really brings the most people forward. I mean, you can do a lot of really least cost things, but that won't necessarily accomplish what we want to for the climate, won't necessarily accomplish what we want to for jobs. So really the idea is trying to make sure that we're doing the things that align to the state's goals. I'll just mention a couple really quickly. The opportunities that Dave mentioned, you know, he's exactly right. So doing what Jessica's talking about in terms of ramping up the renewable energy portfolio in the state can not only bring a lot of jobs in along with that, in terms of people who install solar and the other or wind and the other related jobs that go with that, but can also help bring cleaner energy to more people throughout the state, especially people that haven't been able to take advantage of that in the past. A lot of the people that Reverend Pierce is talking about. And that's also true with electric vehicles as we ramp up those as well. There are a lot of jobs opportunities there, but there are also a lot of opportunities to bring new technology in a way to some people who haven't been able to take advantage of that. And in addition to that, as we're ramping up electric vehicles, let's ramp it up to the point where the more electric vehicles and the parts that are needed to build them are built in Illinois. Let's try to create the jobs that can really provide good paying jobs for people going forward. So there's a ton of issues. We've talked about a lot of them. There are even more. And Dave's right. I mean, they're really, really complicated issues, but there are a lot of good people that are trying to work through figuring out what the best way is to do it.
Thank you to all our panelists. So we just heard Doug and some of the other panelists talk about the investments, the jobs, the economic boost that addressing some of these challenges could bring. So this third question is, how will proposed policy impact local, regional, and state economy in the near and long term? So I'd like to direct this to Reverend Pierce, and we'll see where we are on time and see if any other panelists want to chime in. So once again, how will proposed policy impact local, regional, and state economies in the near and long term?
Well, I believe that as we are looking at how I'll talk about how they should impact a local, regional, and the U.S. economy. They should do it in ways that benefit everyone. Because the story of US is it's a place of great opportunity. I love the United States. It's maybe in my opinion, the best place on the planet, but it does have a history that has caused people of color to fall up on the short end of things. So we need to structure this development in ways that benefit everyone, and I underscore everyone, meaning people of color as well. And so as we do that, I'd like to refer to what I and others refer to as a virtuous cycle. That virtuous cycle has to provide training and contractor development for everyone, including people at the bottom, so that we use solar rec incentives like CEJA's equity point system and set-asides to make sure that folks that have been left out, that they get hired and that they get contracts, such that we build these projects in Black and brown communities in ways that the community members see the potential of green energy and solar, and that they then seek to become trained and seek to become involved in contractor development. Because where there is a lack of opportunity, sometimes that causes people to not even pursue opportunity if they don't believe that they're going to be able to capitalize on it. So that needs everything needs to be structured in that way. And so since there are two realities that exist in the American marketplace, one reality is that people tend to hire and promote people who look like them. And we ought not act like that doesn't happen. That really does happen. So when it comes to people of color, we've got to make sure that we do things to make sure that they are in positions to hire and promote people that look like them. Otherwise, they will get left out. And the other thing is, when we look at the business marketplace, that's typically a marketplace that's driven in many ways from the top down. That's why CEOs are so, I guess, so important in that marketplace, and their salaries are so much higher. So that as we look at this virtuous cycle, and at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we have a lot of BIPOC people, or a fair amount, phrase it that way, of BIPOC people that are employed, so they get jobs and they become subcontractors. But critical to that is making sure that we get the proper amount of BIPOC people in the field as general contractors, because it will be the general contractors that will really, in many ways, drive the amount of subcontractors that will be out there and the amount of employees that are going to be out there. So CEJA includes several provisions to help make this happen in a fair way. One, there will be, I believe, 16 hubs across Illinois in which individuals can get training and get technical assistance, so that one, they can obviously understand what solar is. They can then be trained and get technical assistance to become subcontractors in the field. But there's also part of the CEJA package of programs, a prime accelerator program that's intended to make sure that there are BIPOC general contractors out there to make all of this happen beneath them. And that BIPOC general contractor program is tied to a green energy, a green bank type program to make sure that there's adequate funding. Because when it comes to BIPOC people, one of the biggest impediments in the country, as well as in Illinois, is funding for them. So we need that green energy type bank in Illinois to make sure that funding is there. And that BIPOC accelerator program includes things like up to $1 million in grants for these BIPOC general contractors, low and no interest loans to make sure that they succeed. And if they succeed, then we're going to see subcontractors succeeding beneath them. And if they succeed, then we're going to see the training program succeeding by getting people trained and getting the jobs. So I don't know how much time I've eaten up. I've probably eaten up quite a bit. So I'm going to open it up so others can comment as well. There's certainly more that can be said, but I think you catch the drift of what I'm saying here. The last thing I'll say here is that we've been running a training program here in the Central Illinois area. And that training program has been averaging about a cost of about $12,500 per student. That's just the training side. So when we said money is needed to make this work. So I'll let others come in now.
So I think we've got about 10 minutes left in our planned panel. So let's go ahead and move on to the question 4. And if anybody, this last question is for everybody. Kathy's going to ask it. If somebody did want to chime in on something Reverend Pierce said, go ahead. But for time's sake, let's go ahead and move on. Thank you, Reverend Pierce.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks to Reverend Pierce. I think you really set the stage for this next question very well, in that, you know, the policy itself is so comprehensive, and really trying to think about all of those different co-benefits that need to be in place in this policy, so that you have the intended positive benefits for communities, for utilities, for everyone concerned. So I'd like to hear from the panel members a little bit about what they feel needs to occur that can really support these changes in a comprehensive fashion going forward, and how that's playing out in the policy. So I'll just open it up for Dave, Jessica, Doug. The first one to hit the unmute button gets this, right? How's that?
Sure, I can kick us off.
Start that. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, so what needs to occur? This is a good question. So there's several energy bills that have been introduced. I know the Senate is hearing having subject matter hearings. They had one on CEJA this morning, hearing all of them. So several energy bills, but to a point Doug made earlier, there's a lot of common interest. I think it's important to note that Illinois did join the U.S. Climate Alliance. And with that commitment, there is a commitment for the state to take real on the ground action to combat climate change. So I think there is a commitment to move forward with increased renewables and energy efficiency. And now working together to come to some understanding and joint understanding what that bill looks like. So I do think that has been the purpose of the governor's working groups too, which obviously Doug can speak more to, is to like have these discussions and come to some common ground. Some other co-benefits that can be created that have been touched on too earlier are job creation. There's a huge opportunity of moving to clean energy for job creation, centering equity, the just transition for communities, with the increase in renewable energy and energy efficiency, also mitigating the impacts of climate change. Additionally, comprehensive clean energy policy could aid in the states for COVID-19 recovery. We've seen the devastating impacts of COVID-19, including close to 24,000 deaths in Illinois. I just looked it up this morning to have that quote, and the impact on our economy. So it's been really terrible. And I think moving forward in a recovery, clean energy could play a role in that. And to other points that Reverend Pierce has talked about too, is really ensuring that that recovery is equitable and sustainable, in recognizing the disparities in Black and Brown communities of achieving clean energy in those communities. This was also highlighted in the governor's 8 principles document that was linked in the chat, of the need to have a particular focus on environmental justice communities that are suffering from the impacts of both climate change and COVID, and highlighting the health consequences of economic, social, and environmental injustices. So I think there is the co-benefit of also improved public health of moving to clean energy, that the state could really benefit from having a comprehensive energy bill pass this session.
Thanks, Jessica. Dave, it looks like you're ready to go next. Do you want to
No,
add to that?
I better hear from Doug first, but I'm happy to go. Look, we need to pass a bill this session. I actually think it'll be advantageous in all likelihood we'll need to pass it by May 25th before the next PJM capacity construct auction. But yeah, we need to pass a bill. It needs, I think it's clear, certainly from our view, it's always been the case. It needs to be a comprehensive bill because all these component parts work better together in our view. And I think just looking at the situation right now, the two comprehensive bills out there are CJA, the bill we support, and the Clean Jobs Coalition supports. And now we have a bill from Labor, from Climate Jobs Illinois, that I think there's a fair amount of common ground, but there's obviously some tensions and some issues that need to be worked out. So the big question at the end of the day is, how are we going to get from where we are now to, in 50 days or so, get a bill across the finish line? And I think we can do it. It's a similar dynamic to what we faced with the Future Energy Jobs Act. But you know, it is going to require some work. So you know, I know we need to do it. I know we have a great opportunity. I know if we don't, it's going to put the state back. But you know, we're hopeful that we can get something across the finish line here, and we look forward to working certainly with the governor, the leaders, and you know, legislators and Climate Jobs Illinois on how we put a comprehensive bill together that can pass.
Yeah, and I'll talk about it just from you know, the idea, starting where Dave was, that a bill needs to pass, and then there's a lot that needs to happen after that. And I know we're going to talk in a minute about the process for getting a bill passed, but you know, what needs to happen after that? There is a lot of stuff. So you're going to need a whole lot of rulemakings. You're going to need the state to be a leader, frankly, on certain things, like on, you know, making sure their own buildings are energy efficient, making sure their own fleets are comporting to the goals and the plan. A lot of education needs to happen for folks throughout the state. I mean, there's just, you know, a lot of these things. We're going to try to create a lot of programs that are going to try to bring benefits throughout the state. Well, we've got to be able to have a system that's going to allow people to understand what those benefits are so that they can take advantage of them. There are a whole lot of new processes that are anticipated in the different bills that are out there, a lot of which are going to require stakeholder engagement, both on the front end and during the processes, and then a lot of monitoring afterwards to make sure, to Reverend Pierce's point from before, make sure that whatever we pass is actually doing what we want it to do, and make sure that if there are adjustments that need to be made, that we're doing them. It's not coming back every 5 years or so, but maybe coming back on a more regular basis to try to do that. So there's a lot of things about working with our neighbors in other states. There are ways that there are some things that we can do in concert with other states that will be more beneficial for Illinois and also for the other states if you work on those together. And on things like the RTO reform, Dave talked about that a little bit with the PJM side, but there are a lot of ways that the RTOs, and Illinois is in two different regional transmission organizations, a lot of ways that they could welcome more clean energy into it. Both of them could do that, and we as a state need to work with them as well in trying to do that. And Governor addressed PJM's annual membership meeting talking about that very subject. So there's a lot to do after this. It doesn't, you know, everything kind of gets built into the bill and the catharsis that is the end of a legislative session. But there's a whole lot of work to do after that, after a bill passes as well.
And so I guess if I get to comment now, I agree with everything that's been said, and I'll just quickly mention something that hasn't been said in terms of what needs to be done. When we look at the fact that the energy industry in Illinois was deregulated, it was deregulated because of some negative behavior of the utilities. And so we want to keep that in mind as we move forward. Whether that behavior was intentional or unintentional, that's for other people to discuss right now. I don't think that's the intent of the discussion right now, but it did exist. And there's also other actors out there, whether you call them good actors, bad actors, that's up to you. But there are players out there like Vistra that really owns most of the downstate coal plants. We need to make sure that these players do not co-opt the legislation as it moves forward to foster the ends that they would seek that really led to deregulation in the first place. So all of these other things that we're saying need to be done. We've got to get a bill passed. It's got to be comprehensive. It's got to have all these other pieces in it. But we also have to make sure that it's not co-opted by the utilities and those actors that could be defined as bad actors. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for a really rich conversation. I think our goal for today, as Emily stated in the beginning, is really just to provide some of that background as to the why this policy discussion is happening in Illinois today, and what some of the desirable outcomes that are being sought in these policy considerations. Most of us are not experts in how policy is formed and how it gets made at the state level. And so I've asked Doug if he could give us just a little bit of background on, where are we in the conversations in the state, and what do we expect to see happen over the next few weeks in this policy deliberation that's happening in Illinois.
Sure, thanks, Kathy. I'm happy to, and I'll try to be quick because I know there are questions out there. But we're going to see next week a report done by a group that's been doing an audit of Exelon's nuclear plants to try to figure out to the extent that subsidies may be needed to keep those plants viable going forward. That obviously has a big impact on the amount of clean energy in the state, also in terms of the costs and the other issues that we've all talked about. You're likely to see a bill from the governor. A lot of the stakeholder process that's been going on for a year has been designed to try to get everybody's ideas out on the table. And I think the governor has said during that process that he didn't want to work off of any one particular bill. So there's been a lot of bills out there, and we've talked about a lot of them today, whether that's the Clean Energy Jobs Act or the labor bill that was referenced, or the Path to 100. Ameren's got a bill, Vistra has a bill. There are a number of them out there. So the idea will be to try to, the governor put out his principles back in August to have a bill that's good, with respect to those principles, but we'll incorporate, I'm guessing, a lot of the things that we've seen through some of the other bills that are out there, and trying to come up with the best amalgamation that he and his office can. And so you've got from the time from now, really, and when that bill gets dropped until the end of May, to discuss all of these. There will be legislative processes. They've already happened for some of the bills where the committees have passed them out onto the floor, although none have been acted on the floor yet. But that will happen, and there will be negotiation and kind of vetting of all the proposals. A lot of discussions to see, as we said, a lot of the direction is the same from a lot of the groups that are working on this in a comprehensive way. So the question is going to be, what's the best way to accomplish what a whole lot of people are trying to do. So that the idea that of the whole process going forward, or actually going back from the last year, has been so that when we get to this point where we're at right now, there really aren't any surprises. People have heard the concepts, they've seen actual language in bills, they've seen other broad policy statements. And so the idea now is to try to coalesce all of that knowledge that we've all worked on over the last year in the subgroups, and a lot of people were working on it obviously before that. And really try to make sure that we've got a bill that really does all the things that we've been talking about today. It's very complicated, as everybody said, but I think we've got time to do that, and I think we can end up with a really good product going forward. And part of the reason to do it the way that it's been done was to change the way that it had been done in the past, which was a relatively small number of people got together, they wrote bills. Back room is probably not a fair way to say it, but really a relatively small number of people wrote bills. This one, we tried to involve as many people as we possibly could in that whole process, as I know some of the other groups did in their processes as well. So hopefully all of that combined work and combined knowledge will result in a really good product for the people of Illinois.
Yes,
Kathy,
thank
if you're
you.
talking, you can't hear you. There you go.
No, I was just moving around on the screen here. So thank you, Doug. I know that locally and in the conversations that we've had the opportunity to convene with communities that are going to be directly impacted by this policy, that they really appreciated the opportunity to voice their views in the conversation. So I commend you for that effort. I think we're going to move to the questions that we've tried to capture from the chat space, and we'll continue to take those for the time that we have remaining if folks do have additional questions. But let me start with one of the questions that we found in the chat space. And I think that has to do with what are you hearing as panelists? Can you speak to what issues are being addressed from that private sector point of view? So our utility companies certainly play a role in the formation of this policy. Can you speak directly to how those utility companies have been involved in this policy and considerations that are being given to the utility companies in particular? Someone want to take that as a question?
I'll just start from the governor's working group process. Utilities have been invited to and participated fairly robustly in a lot of the working groups that we had. The idea was for just the reason that you just said, Kathy, that a lot of the implementation of these ideas necessarily has to run through utilities. Not all of it, but a lot of it does. And so getting their opinions on how that works will be very important. I will say, I think in the past that utilities have had outsized influence, and don't take my word for that. Look at the deferred prosecution agreement, in terms of the things that have already been mentioned here before. So the idea was to have a process where they would be included and their ideas and their thoughts would be part of it, but that wouldn't be, that they wouldn't have oversized importance, and that wouldn't be the dominant theory, that we wanted to make sure everybody had a seat. But they've clearly been part of all the working group discussions that we've had and been allowed to present, their own policy initiatives and things that, and how they think different policies would impact them.
Thank you. I think Amanda has the next question.
Yeah, someone was curious about potential policy solutions that include incentives for building electric charging stations in rural Illinois for new electric cars. And I think we could talk about that for rural Illinois and also other parts of Illinois as well. I'll just let you guys chime in.
Yeah, I can just jump in. So from the Clean Energy Jobs Act perspective, so there's a large transportation and beneficial electrification sections to the bill. CEJA does provide EV charging rebates for customers who spread electric demand over time, benefiting the grid. There's also funding for new public EV charging stations in population dense or low income areas. And in addition to that, the bill also builds quick charging stations in rural areas and along highways. So it is addressed within the Clean Energy Jobs Act.
Yeah, if I could just build on that, I think that if we do it right, transportation electrification has great potential for the state, and actually great potential even for those who don't drive or own an EV. But the key thing here is this concept, beneficial electrification. And one of the things that CUB we're going to be looking at closely here is as we move toward a final package, which we believe should include robust electrification measures. We just want to make sure that it's done in a way that's optimal for consumers and the grid, because it really gets down to this point that Jessica was referring to around making sure, to simplify a little bit, that you're charging cars when it's best and least cost for the grid, and not charging them when it would increase costs. And if we do that well, all the modeling shows that has a price suppressive effect on rates. But this is why these issues can be a little bit complicated. But yeah, we think CEJA contains beneficial electrification. And we think that, we know the Climate Jobs Illinois bill includes electrification provisions in it. We think there's a good opportunity here for the state, and we're hopeful that something will be done there.
And I'll add this, included in what Jessica was saying is the focus of CEJA on electrification from a mass transit standpoint, as it looks at school districts and what can be done there. Because when we talk about school districts, urban, suburban, and rural areas, all of them have school districts. And so when you look at the buses and the electrification of them and the charging stations that would go toward them, that will heavily benefit rural areas as well as urban and suburban.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And when you think about the distances that are driven in the rural areas, very much, often much greater than they are in the urban areas. So they need to have electrification and have the infrastructure be built out in all areas is really, really important. And again, this is another one of those areas where there can be a lot of ancillary benefits because, as we start to see all the different auto companies talk about, all their models by such and such a date are going to be electric vehicles. It's incumbent on us to really start this process right away, and also to take advantage of that, take advantage of the opportunities that are there to build more vehicles and more parts for those vehicles here in the state. We've got Rivian, that's great. We've got a lot of other auto parts suppliers and other auto manufacturers in the state here. And as they transform into electric, it's a great economic opportunity for us that also has the climate benefits that we've been talking about.
Amanda, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you had another question picked out.
Oh, you are. Okay, let's go for the really tough one that's in there. There were a couple of questions in the chat space that we combined, and we're wondering if you could talk about how Exelon and nuclear may fit into some of the policy considerations and solutions. Someone want to tackle that one?
Well, I guess I can start. Let me say at the outset, I think what the governor's office has done is exactly the right thing to do, to have an independent analysis with a very credible organization, Synapse Economics, looking at the underlying economics. Stepping back a little bit, from a consumer perspective, if the nuclear plants close before coal and gas, it's going to be very difficult to cost effectively achieve our state's decarbonization goals. That doesn't mean it's an excuse for a blank check. It doesn't mean that not a single nuclear plant can close prematurely. But it does mean that when you just run the models, and we've done lots of them, that those nuclear plants are an asset for a path to 100% clean energy and a path to 100% renewables. So it raises some complicated questions around what you do with that information. And I think the Synapse report here will be key. But just practically speaking, a competitive advantage that we have in this state is that we do have a large source of carbon-free electricity that will allow us to bridge to 100% renewables in a way that I think is much more cost-effective than other states. And, that is what it is in our view.
I'll add a couple of things, because I know the time is short, and this is just an incredibly complicated issue because it involves so much. Obviously, the dollars involved are very large. I mean, we've been subsidizing since 2017. We've been subsidizing a couple of the nuclear plants already. That's a $235 million a year subsidy that ends up going to Exelon. So the questions that you've got to ask yourself, Dave's exactly right, that it's a huge part of the clean energy mix in Illinois, and it does give us, in terms of clean energy, a real advantage. there are also all the jobs that are there. It's the nuclear plants are almost always, I think, and in this case, always the largest taxing taxed entity in the locations where they're at. So there are huge impacts for those communities, like we've talked about with some of the coal communities as well. The question becomes, if we're transitioning to a mid-century kind of clean energy construct, how long are the nuclear plants going to be there? A lot of them have licenses that expire before 2050. And the question becomes, what is that subsidy that's needed to keep them going? And then you compare that to what are the other options that we have to try to build out clean energy in the near and midterm and long term. And that's part of the work that Synapse is doing for the governor's office and trying to find out what those numbers really are. We've really never been, even with the subsidies that passed before, in my opinion, we've never had a really good accounting of what the plants actually needed. It was kind of an ask from Exelon at that point. I think this will give us better data. This will give us better information to be able to make those kinds of decisions to decide, because what the governor said is he sees nuclear energy as a really integral part of the clean energy economy going forward. The question is, at what cost? And it can't be, and I believe somebody used the term blank check, it can't be a blank check. And we have to compare it to all of the other costs of building out the clean energy system going forward, whether that's renewables, whether that's additional energy efficiency, all of the different things that we're talking about in a comprehensive bill.
Thank you for that. I think we have, if you're willing, we have just a couple more questions that are left. Is that right, Amanda? There's just a couple that are unique and we'll consider in our discussion here. Are you ready to go ahead with a question, Amanda? You looked poised.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, I think I'm ready. And I think this is maybe another difficult one, at least for me to phrase. So there was a question in the chat from a small solar business owner that expressed disappointment not to see a solar short-term funding fix passed during the lame duck session. She expressed support for union labor, but it looks like this question is specifically for Doug. And it is why, when we have current legislation that allows various pathways for DG certification, solar installations in the state, that it seems that organized labor is trying to ensure that they get a larger piece of the pie. So I think just touching on how we heard a lot about equity and the need to support new jobs in disadvantaged communities. So if you could just speak to kind of addressing that moving forward and all of the policy pieces that we've seen. And let's start with Doug.
Gee, a really easy one, Amanda. So yeah, this is really difficult, and this is something that's taking up a lot of discussion now. During the last couple of weeks, and will be through the time a bill actually passes. So one of the, you've heard a lot about the desire, the very real desire from everybody on the call to make sure, and Reverend Pierce eloquently, stated it, the way that we really need to try to make the clean energy economy, the jobs that are part of the clean energy economy, look a lot more like the state. So that's a goal that I think all of us have, and we're trying to move forward with that. Part of the question becomes then, from an organized labor standpoint, organized labor, because they're seeing losses on from the coal plants, potentially from the nuclear plants, they've got an interest in making sure there's additional labor, organized labor that's part of that. And the governor is very supportive of organized labor as well. So the question becomes, how do we balance those two things? How do we make sure that the projects that we've all talked about, we all want to see, whether it's renewable energy or EV installations, how do those go forward? How do we get the jobs to the folks that we want to have, and also provide those good paying jobs that we all want? They're not mutually exclusive, but it's really difficult to try to thread that needle and make sure that we're addressing both of those issues. So that's going to sound a little bit like a non-answer, but it's not, because we're really trying very hard to address both of those concepts at the present time. And I'm sure the other panelists will have some thoughts on that as well. or not. I figured sure Reverend would have some comments about that. So.
Thank you
Well, since you're trying to, it looks like, debate me here.
No, not at all.
No, I will just repeat what you have said. It is, at the end of the day, whatever the negotiated bill will be, and hopefully it will be done before the end of May, we have to thread that needle. No one is saying that the labor is not important and should not have an important role in this. But I think all of us are saying that just like utilities role in the past had been viewed as outsized and we were trying to correct that, I think we're trying to say that whatever happens with labor here, it should not be outsized at the expense of equity. And there's been a problematic history in Illinois or in the Midwest in terms of having the membership of labor, if I'll phrase it that way, look like the surrounding communities. And so that's the goal. Labor has said a lot in terms of aspirational comments about getting there. Now, the real issue will be the details. Do the details actually, in an applicable way, translate into BIPOC, significant BIPOC participation, if it's labor or if it's other jobs, whatever it is? Do they translate to significant BIPOC participation? And that participation, the number one measure for me is not percentage of BIPOC that's in labor or that kind of thing. It's percentage of BIPOC work hours compared to the overall work hours. Because you can have a certain portion of the membership be BIPOC, that doesn't mean that that membership is getting its equal percentage of the work hours. So at the end of the day, that's what we're going to be focused on, not just issues of inputs like how many people went through training and all of that. We're looking at outputs. How many people got jobs that are BIPOC, and what percentage of those jobs overall were BIPOC, so that we, over the long term, reach a new energy economy that looks like the state of Illinois. And I believe BIPOC, the BIPOC population in Illinois is about 40%. So anyway, that I hope I've answered what Doug invited me to answer there. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you for that great discussion. How about an easier question, maybe for a conversation here? So if we can move on, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier in our conversation, but just to reiterate, because it was in the chat space, is there a role for education that helps to, maybe deal with the regulation also, but is there an important role that education needs to play in this transformation? Can you speak to that?
I'll start, but I'll try to be brief. And I know everybody on this panel has done a lot in terms of education with energy issues. So absolutely, a huge role for education now. Things like this, where we're talking about the bills that are out there, the things that the CJC did, and going around the state and talking to everyone about these issues and finding out what was most important to them. So prior to anything passing, obviously, then when things pass, there will be opportunities for different stakeholder engagements. There will be opportunities and necessity, really, to start talking about these different programs and how people can take advantage of them. We've talked a lot here about how we want to make sure that the results of this are equitable and that it touches everyone in the state. Well, there's a lot of follow through to make sure that works. That's an educational part. That's monitoring, as we talked about before, to make sure that what we said we wanted to do, we're actually accomplishing going forward. So yeah, education is a huge part of this before a bill passes, while a bill's being discussed, and certainly afterwards.
Yeah, what Doug said, absolutely. Education plays a huge role. I think there's so many energy bills out there, so really understanding what's in each of them and ensuring we get the best policy for Illinoisans and ensuring that it's building us towards that clean energy future. And I think too, just generally broadly, education on climate change and the impacts is important too, and understanding where people's electricity comes from. CUB does a great job with like bill assistance and understanding electricity bills and really understanding that, which I think is critical for the average Illinois resident to understand that.
Doug and
Fantastic.
Jessica as well.
Go ahead.
Nothing to add to that.
Yeah, I'll say this, that as everyone has said, education is critical in all facets of this. And there are, if we want, at the end of the day, this to be of greatest benefit to the people of Illinois, that will not happen if the people of Illinois don't understand what's going on and have their input. So we have to have education all across the board. To give a kind of a specific, quick example of threading the needle that Doug and I were talking about a moment ago. In some of the conversations with labor, it's understandable. Labor is saying, well, they want prevailing wage in everything. And right now, today, at the lower end of these projects, which is in the distributed generation projects, those projects aren't costing out at a prevailing wage level. So then the question becomes on the table, should that area be an area of prevailing wage or not? And because even the majority owned companies that are there are not paying prevailing wage there, or if prevailing wage is included there, how can it be included in such a way that it makes these projects viable? So there has to be some subsidy there to make that happen. So I'm not stating the answer to that question. I just threw that out as an example, and educating the public on that and the stakeholders involved is critical to getting to a solution that everyone at the end of the day will believe to be somewhat fair.
Thank you for that. David, did you have a comment that you wanted to add to the education conversation?
No, I mean, other than it's incredibly important for all the reasons that were mentioned.
Fantastic. Well, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists. It was a very rich conversation. I felt like we had great expertise on the call here today, and we greatly appreciate you taking time to share your insights with so many people across the state. So this recording will be made available to everyone who participated and will be live on our University of Illinois Extension site going forward. So that learning and inquiry can continue. So thank you very much for your hard work today. And thank you for sharing your insights. We greatly appreciate your engagement.